to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got a great show for you today. Ken and I, we are going to be like fanboys here. We're going to be talking with Dr. Andy Davis, who is a research scientist down in University of Georgia. So I'm kind of mumbling over my words because I'm very excited to have him on the show today. And, you know, I'm not doing this by myself, because if I was doing this by myself, I would be sweating, shaking in my boots. So I have to have horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Whew. Ken, I made it through the intro on my own. Thank goodness you showed up.
Good job. It was perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Well, before we get to the topic at hand, we have to delve into Cicada Watch 2024. How are things going down in Jacksonville? Any cicadas?
It's going amazing. So last Wednesday, so was that the 15th or no, 8th? We had saw first cicadas coming out. It's been kind of a trickle, but the last couple of days we're seeing more and more. I think the cloudiness and stuff is maybe slowed them down a little bit. Did hear a few singing on over the weekend. We've got kind of a butterfly cage pop-up thing. We've probably got 20, 30 adults in, and they're singing in our house every once in a while. So it's going to get loud soon.
And Ken, you also did text me a picture of how you have also not only been enjoying their singing, but also been enjoying flavor. Am I spilling too much here? Do you want to reveal that maybe next week when we talk about them?
I have tried some, but yeah, we'll save that for next week when we do the eating show.
That's right. Yes, the incredible edible cicada. So we will talk about that next week. Teaser alert here. Also want to put out a plug. A colleague of ours, Brodie Dunn, he has started his own podcast. You might recognize his name. He's been on the show before. He's doing the bee hotel study right now. That's the last show that he did with us. But he has started his own podcast called Voice of the Wild, where he takes recordings from the Macaulay Library and he plays those. And he just sort of explains what this is. Mostly it's been bird song. And so he just talks about specific birds. And so if you want to, we'll leave a link down to Brodie's podcast in the show notes below. It's delightful. Each episode's it's short, about 2 minutes long. So it's just a fun little way to relax and unwind listening to nature sounds. Well, Ken, are we ready to get to the topic at hand? I feel like we need a drum roll or something. Maybe I can add that in post, but I don't know how, so I'll figure it out. All right. Well, we have to introduce our special guest for today. We are joined by Dr. Andy Davis down in the wonderful warm state of Georgia. I've been there several times and enjoyed each time. And so, Dr. Davis.
Go dogs.
Go dogs. Yeah. Yes. I have no allegiance to any schools. These Illini folks just pay my paycheck. So, but Andy, welcome to the show. We are so happy to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, folks. It's always great to get to talk to people about monarchs, one of my favorite topics, and it's always great to be able to get into a podcast like this to be able to reach more people. That's kind of my thing these days, is trying to reach people with the science.
Well, you're doing a lot of this work, and I think we're going to dive into this topic, and we'll try to hit this a couple of times throughout the show. But I first stumbled on you. Ken actually said you need to check out this Facebook page, The Thoughtful Monarch, and again, we'll make sure that we're linking to this stuff in the show. But yeah, The Thoughtful Monarch is this really active Facebook page that you manage.
Yeah, it's a group that sort of came from, many years of my trying to have a forum to be able to tell people what the science shows around the monarch butterfly, because I think the monarchs, everybody has these ideas about what monarchs need, what the research shows. A lot of that information that people think that they know, may or may not be true. And it's because they're getting their information from various sources. A lot of it is coming from social media. And so I sort of sat down one day and said, okay, if all of this misinformation is present in social media, we need to have a place where there's accurate information about the monarchs. And so that's where the idea came from, just to be able to have a place in a seat at the table, right, in the conversation about monarchs.
Mhm.
It's been quite the journey. It's been a year and some change since I've started it. It's been a learning experience for me.
I think we're all learning about that impact of social media. It is very common now where I get sent a TikTok video or Instagram post or something, and they say, "Is this true? Is this real?" Actually, just this morning, I could not recognize the plant that they put on there, so I actually went to AI and I put that in there. Turns out the image I was sent was an AI generated image of a plant. It wasn't even a real plant. And I actually found the exact copy online. So
that's
frustrating.
A big fear, right? Is you know, it's at some point, we're already at this point now, where at some point it's going to be getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's not, right? And social media is where all of this stuff is sort of happening in real time in front of us, and people are confused about a lot of things, like monarchs are one of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, Andy, could you maybe just spend a few minutes to introduce yourself? You can do it better than I think either of us can. I mean, I read that you are at University of Georgia, and you're at this not the Odin, but the Odum School of ecology or biology?
Yeah. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I've been here since 2010, I believe, as a professor. My background is diverse. I'm what you could call like an all-around naturalist, ecologist, with maybe a specialty in animals, animal physiologies, and especially animal migrations, which is where I sort of first got my love of the monarchs. But I've studied a lot of critters and things in my time, from birds to amphibians, to beetles, parasites. My problem is that I'm too excited about too many things, right? And I have a hard time focusing on one thing. I've probably spent the longest time in my career studying the monarch butterflies. So if I'm an expert on anything in this world, it's probably monarchs. But even then, I mean, I feel like my knowledge is somewhat limited because people have been studying monarchs for decades and decades, right? And so of all of the critters to focus on, this is one where like the literature on the monarchs is just vast. And so no wonder people have a hard time, keeping up with it because, every week there's a new study on the monarch butterflies, right? And it's been like that for decades. And so I literally have stacks and stacks of scientific studies in my office and in my lab here. That it's like this tall. It's tremendous how much research has gone on in the monarch butterflies.
Well, I'd say it's time to dive into that research. So we do have a list of questions for you today to really kind of unpack this. And so, Ken, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off, please.
All right. So I think for a lot of people, I say especially recently, the decline of monarchs has kind of been their introduction to monarchs or becoming interested in them. So it's been in the news a lot. This winter, count came out and populations were particularly low in Mexico this year. So are we going to see fewer monarchs this summer because of that?
Okay, so let me stop you right there because most of what you said is wrong. but to be fair, this is where everybody this is where everybody starts, right? The same way you just said. They see the news about the declines in Mexico. So just to back up really from the get-go, right? People should know that the monarchs spend their winter at these Mexico colonies in these mountaintop regions where they hang out on trees. You've probably seen like the National Geographic videos of this, and it's a spectacular phenomenon. The entire population attempts to make this one long distance migration every fall to those places. And then at the end of the end of the winter, they'll sort of remigrate northward. And that's kind of where we are right now. We're sort of midway through the spring migration northward as the monarchs are traveling back. And so what you're pointing out there is that this past winter, the numbers of monarchs at that wintering colony was pretty low. In fact, it was one of the lowest we've seen. However, that is one snapshot of one time point in the monarch's grand life cycle, right, throughout the entire year. We have other snapshots where people have been tracking monarch numbers for many decades in some cases, and including in Illinois. And there's actually a group, a volunteer-based group that has been counting the numbers of butterflies in Illinois for a number of decades now, and they do that every summer. And they use very standardized methods. I've seen their data on the numbers of monarchs that they've counted over the last 30 years. And guess what? The numbers of monarchs they've counted hasn't really changed over the last 30 years. It's gone up and down, some randomness, some random noise here and there. But overall, there's been no long-term decline in the numbers of monarchs counted in Illinois, where you are, right? And so when people say that the monarchs are declining, they get this impression that they're declining across the board, like everywhere, because people think the numbers of monarchs in Mexico represents the entire population, but it doesn't. It really represents the numbers of monarchs, and this is really important, it really represents the numbers of monarchs that successfully made it to Mexico. See the difference there? Mm-hmm. And so we used to think that the entire population, like quote unquote, every fall, the entire population would all travel down to Mexico where they'd hang out, spend the winter, and that allowed us to sort of count the numbers or the size of the wintering colonies. It all seems so logical and so convenient for us scientists, right? And to be fair, this was the thinking even almost 15 years ago. People thought, and some people still do, that the numbers of monarchs in Mexico represented the entire population. But I just told you what's going on in Illinois, right? So clearly, the numbers of monarchs in Mexico, that trend, it doesn't represent what's happening in Illinois. And so what is probably going on, and in fact, we have some good evidence of this happening now, is that during the summer, the monarchs are just rebounding every summer. Like the population is sort of recouping their losses every summer very readily, actually. And so every summer you see basically the same numbers you've seen every summer. But the numbers that actually successfully arrive in Mexico seems to have been going down. So really, it's not the monarchs that are declining. It's the migration. That's the one thing that seems to be the big trouble right now. Getting to Mexico safely is the big trouble, the big problem. So really, it's not really that monarchs have a numbers problem. Like it's not like we're producing not enough monarchs. Certainly not in Illinois. You're producing just as many as you always have. It's just that they're having trouble reaching that wintering destination. So given that I just told you this, that kind of means that the numbers in Mexico are not really a good snapshot to look at to begin with. It's almost misleading, right? Because I just told you what's happening in Illinois. Mm-hmm. And so really, if you're a homeowner in Illinois, what's the best thing to look at? You can look at the numbers of monarchs in Mexico. Yeah, that might tell you something, but it's also misleading because in your backyard, you have the same numbers of monarchs you always have. That's a hard thing. There's some nuance to that, right? And so there's a lot of things that are going against what I'm saying here that are sort of working against me, trying to convince people of this situation. And this is sort of getting into the problems with misinformation and social media and all that stuff. Like this idea that the monarchs are declining has sort of become like a symbolic of the general decline of the environment, right? And or insect declines everywhere. And there's a lot of emotions wrapped up in this idea that the monarchs are in trouble. And there's a lot of money passing hands back and forth, people trying to sell you plants to save the monarchs, right? Or people trying to sell you something to rear the butterflies in, like a little cage. Or there's actual funds being transferred from the government to various organizations for their efforts to save the monarchs, right? So for a lot of different reasons, this idea that the monarchs are in trouble is still around. It's still perpetuating, despite what I've just told you. And it's a little frustrating for me as a scientist because I'm just a guy who looks at data all day. And from the data I see, I just told you what they show. But yet there's still this perception, and you even just sort of articulated it, right? That the monarchs are in trouble and we all need to do something.
Mm-hmm.
This is another reason why I started this Facebook group, right? Because there's so much of this misinformation. Not that what you said, Ken, was wrong per se, because there really has been a decline in the numbers of monarchs in Mexico, right? There's just more nuance to that story.
Now, I'm curious then, in Illinois, kind of a few years ago, the big news was whisperings of potential listings of the monarch on the endangered species. So kind of based on what you just said, what's your thoughts on that proposal on the books? Because there's, I mean, a lot of farmers, land managers, all that makes them very nervous.
Yeah, so I'm sighing a little bit because it's a big hard topic. Mm-hmm. I have some thoughts on it, but I'm kind of torn myself, and some of my colleagues are torn too, because, number one, listing the monarchs as endangered would be sort of a crime against science, right? Because the population is not declining, from what I just said, right? There's one snapshot. At one time point, there's a decline. However, they're clearly able to rebound every summer, right? And in fact, they may have been doing this for hundreds of years, for all we know. And so there really isn't a numerical, like a decline in the numbers of monarchs in North America. There really isn't. In fact, if you look at the breeding range of the monarchs compared to every other butterfly species, and I've done this, there's 450 different species of butterflies in North America. Guess which one has the biggest breeding range in the entire continent? The monarchs. Mm-hmm. They occupy every state, almost every province in Canada. They have breeding resources in every state and every province. No other butterfly can make that claim. None. I've looked at this. And so their breeding range size is absolutely enormous. You can't have a large breeding range size if you're in trouble. And so compared to a lot of other species, monarchs are like killing it. Like they're really doing well. And so that's why I say if the monarchs were to be listed, it would be a tragedy because it means that the science doesn't really matter. It's more about the actual perception and the perpetuating myth about the monarchs being in trouble, right? And the actual listing decisions, I've actually looked at some of the records that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has based this decision on, and it's all based on the declines in Mexico. There wasn't any consideration of how many monarchs there are in the summer in Illinois or other states where we have similar data. Like there's actually a number of other states where you can actually look at similar trends in monarch abundance, and there's no real long-term decline. But yet that one place in Mexico is the place where there has been a decline. And so if you only look at that, then of course you would think, yes, this species is in trouble. But the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service didn't do that. They just looked at the Mexico colonies and the numbers going down. So on the one hand, it would be a crime against science if they were listed. However, I have some alternative thoughts on this, and this is going to get into another another hot topic. If the monarchs were to be listed officially in this country as endangered, that might bring in some legislation that prevents people from actually touching them, right? Just like any other endangered species, right? Like you can't bring an endangered whatever into your house to feed it food. And so if the monarchs were to be listed as endangered, that would actually prevent people from doing a whole lot of things that actually aren't helping the monarchs at all right now. And this is another can of worms that, you may not want me to open, but, there's a fair amount of research now showing how the actions of a lot of well-meaning people are actually hindering the very thing that's in trouble, the fall migration. What I'm getting at is when people, like kind-hearted people, see a caterpillar on their backyard milkweed, or they see a bunch of them, and they want to protect those caterpillars from, the ravages of Mother Nature. And so they'll bring those caterpillars into their homes, put them in a tub, or in a container or something like that, and rear them, on milkweed leaves until they reach their adult stage, and then they'll sort of let them free in their backyard, thinking that they're helping, right? It sounds great, right? And people use this as an educational activity for kids, right? And it's a really fun thing to do. People get really jazzed about it. There's some people use this as a way to sort of remember lost loved ones.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of emotion wrapped up in this, and people really love doing it. But there's been some research on this in the last 5 years, this very thing of the releases of captive monarchs. And all of the research from various studies all point to one thing. These monarchs are not really good at migrating. They're just not. Some of them do make it to Mexico, like a small number of them do, but the vast majority don't. And we know that they're, like, I've actually done some of these studies myself. I've actually tested them, these captive reared monarchs. They're actually weaker than wild monarchs, physically weaker. We know that they don't fly as well. We know that their navigational senses are off. There's a number of issues with these captive reared monarchs. We're not really sure why this is happening. Something to do with the indoor environment or even the outdoor environment. Even if you rear them outdoors in a cage, that seems to have a similar negative influence on the monarchs. Not as much as rearing them indoors. But these releases of these captive reared monarchs that are all, not as good at migrating is the actual last thing we need to be doing to help save the monarch migration. See how this is a problem?
Mhm.
So if the monarchs were to be listed as endangered, this could solve that problem, right? No one's going to like it because then they won't be able to have their caterpillar fun anymore. But it might prevent people from going overboard with this thing. That's, as I said, this is a can of worms that, you may not want me to open it up, and people hate it when I talk about this because they just love those caterpillars. They love releasing the monarchs. But, the science is the science, and all of the studies, not even just not my studies, but they all point to the same thing. And I kind of feel like it's my job to sort of tell people what the science shows.
So, it sounds like the monarch has a very compelling story. Maybe one that we were all taught as kids as we learn insect life cycles. And then maybe some, as you said, well-meaning folks take this, they see a caterpillar, or they think, hey, I can raise this caterpillar to become an adult butterfly, maybe help the population. But there's a relatively small number of caterpillars that make it to adult in the wild, correct? Like what percentage actually become adults?
It's a small percentage, but this is also a thing this is another storyline that goes along with this issue that has sort of been corrupted a little bit along the way. So less than 5% of the monarch caterpillars ever make it to adult stage, like in the wild, right? Some people have taken that idea and said, well, this is why we need to rear them in captivity, right? Because there's so many things that are looking to eat them in the wild, right? Because if you rear them in captivity, you'll get like 75 to 95% of them making it to adulthood, right? But that's not the way Mother Nature intended it. And this is the part where everybody gets wrong. So Mother Nature intends for 95% of those caterpillars to be eaten. That's what Mother Nature wants, right? And this is how this gets into the captive rearing thing, right? The reason why I think the wild monarchs are always better when we test them compared to the captive reared monarchs in every test we run They're always better. The reason is because of natural selection. When you get to be a monarch flying around in the wild, right? You've passed all of the rigors of Mother Nature's ravages, right? You've made it to the adult stage, right? You're that 5% that made it. So by default, you're a superstar to begin with, right? You're the one that was able to fend off the predators or avoid them somehow, or you had the best immune defense, or you were the smartest. There's literally research on how captive reared monarchs aren't as smart as wild ones. And so in the wild, the ones you see flying around are superstars to begin with. But in a captive scenario, you're rearing everybody, all of the wimps, all of the rejects that would have died, right, in the wilds of Mother Nature. You're rearing them to adulthood because there's no stressors in a captive scenario, right? You're rearing everybody. And so whenever we test captive reared monarchs versus wild ones, we always see this big difference. That's the reason. And so really, when people want to help the monarchs, it sounds crazy, but the best way you can help them is to just leave them alone in the wild. Sure, some of them are going to die, but that's the way Mother Nature intended it, right? And so, and this is the part where a lot of people they have a hard time with seeing those caterpillars getting eaten by a wasp or whatever it is, right? They see the wasp eating the caterpillar, and then people think, oh my God, I need to stop this from happening, right? But that's actually supposed to happen in nature. That caterpillar was never supposed to make it, right? And so I tell people to leave the monarchs alone. And this is a thing that people really don't like to hear because they want to save them, literally. They see the news, they see the monarchs are in trouble, which is not really the case, and they sort of innately want to help them, right? And so they see the caterpillars in their backyard, and they think, I can help this caterpillar today, right? And so people are sort of taking what they see in the news and extrapolating into what they see in their backyards, and they're trying to do the right thing, but without actually any guidance. And so this is where things are getting confusing for a lot of people because they want to help, but yet, here's this mean scientist telling them to let the caterpillars die. So I get hate mail, right, for telling people what the science shows. I literally do, and it's weird because some of the hate mail I get actually is funny because when I tell people that monarchs are actually doing okay, right, like your Illinois study, I tell people that, and I get pushback. People will get mad at me because they want to be the one to save the monarchs, right? And so this activity that people have in their backyards, like when they bring the monarchs in to rear them, they think that they're helping the population, right? And so they get this sort of savior complex. And I come along and I tell them, the population didn't really need saving, and what you're doing isn't really helping after all. And so I get people getting mad at me for telling them basically what the science shows. And it's been a interesting, as I said before, I'm on social media now, in this Facebook group, trying to convey all of these messages to people, right? And I get pushback from people who don't like to hear it. Not to ramble on too much about this topic, but part of the problem is media hype, right, over the monarchs. This Save the Monarch story has been around for a long time, like at least a decade now. It was always a sort of misconstruing of the actual evidence, right? But that didn't really stop the story from snowballing. And it basically became a self-perpetuating kind of storyline in the media. And to be fair, right, the story kind of writes itself, right? Here's this cute little butterfly that everybody loves, and it's in trouble, or that's what the story says, right? And you can save it by planting milkweed in your backyard, right? And so this story has been written 1,000 times in 1,000 different forums, and it always sells. Always. It gets clicks, it gets reads, people share it. Like those stories about the monarchs being in trouble are just like a gold mine for media personnel, right? And they've told me this. I talked to a lot of journalists. But here's the thing. The journalists never write what I'm telling you because it doesn't sell, right? It doesn't, nobody wants to hear that the monarchs aren't in trouble and you may not be helping after all, right? People don't want to hear it. People don't want to read it. And so the journalists don't write it. It becomes this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where you only see the stories about the monarchs being in trouble. It's a really complex ball of wax, right? And I've been trying to sort of push back on this, in the social media, page that I have. I also have a blog, www.monarchscience.org, just to put in a selfish plug, where I also do the same thing, where I sort of convey some of the science on the monarchs in a layperson kind of way, and to try to sort of show people what the actual science shows, right? And with no spin, no nothing. This is just, here's the study. This is what they did. This is what they found. This is what it means. So I feel like I've been rambling a little bit here because this is kind of my world now, right? Trying to get the science across to people, trying to correct the record over and over again, failing mostly.
No, I'm very guilty of what you say. And it wasn't until Ken pointed me to your blog, which we'll link to, and then we found your Facebook page that I started to change my message and my tone about this whole topic. So you can like chalk one up for me, you got me. So I'm changing my tone, changing my message. I'm adapting based upon what the science and the data is that you're putting out. So,
well, it's amazing how easily it is to fall into this rabbit hole, right? Of, looking at the news, going off of what we see, trying to, take leaps, into intuitive leaps based on what we think is going on, based on what we think they need. And I think I blame some of this gap we have between the science and the public. I blame some of this on the scientists ourselves. Like, we are to blame for some of this problem because, except for me, like too many of my colleagues don't do what I'm doing. They stay in their labs. They write their little papers. They talk to other academics, other scientists, and they never sort of leave the world of academia. And their work, while important, is failing to actually reach everyday people. And that's on us as scientists, right? Because, I don't think that science is sort of adapting to the changing society we have right now, where people are getting more and more of their information online, right? And they're less inclined to actually read the actual scientific paper. They're more inclined to read the news story, which may or may not be true. So I think we scientists need to kind of adapt in some kind of way, almost like what I'm doing, and try to reach people with the message of whatever it is that we're studying, because there is a growing gap right now. And that kind of worries me as a scientist.
So for the rearing, take home message is, we shouldn't be doing that. But what about people who they want to raise the 1 or 2 caterpillars with their kids? Is that okay to do still? Or are we talking like small scale, 1 or 2 is fine? We just want to avoid the large scale where we're cranking out 100 caterpillars and stuff.
I'm sighing again because it's another loaded topic, but 1 or 2 is probably not going to hurt that much. But you got to consider the scale of this practice, across the entire country, in both countries, Canada and the US. There's hundreds of thousands of people doing this, right? If you just look at the numbers of people on social media pages, Facebook groups, if hundreds of thousands of people are each rearing like 5, you can see how this scales up. And most of them aren't rearing just 5, because that's the other problem with doing this. You quickly sort of scale things up, and it becomes almost addictive, really, where And then especially if your caterpillars don't make it to the adult stage in your container, then people sort of want to try it again to get it right. And so it quickly becomes sort of cumulative, and that's when it becomes problematic, right? So, and this is just the mom and pop groups, right? The families that are doing this at a small scale. There's actually commercial outfits that are selling monarchs, captive reared monarchs that are reared in captivity and sold in massive numbers. So that's another situation where there's some science on this too, and those are just as they're not as good as wild monarchs, to be fair. But if you consider both the mom and pops and the commercial groups, right, it's probably millions of monarchs that are being released every year into the population that are captive reared and that aren't very good at migrating. So you see how this is a problem. And so there's another philosophical problem I have, not really a problem, a philosophical thought or a comment, I guess, on just doing this with a couple of caterpillars for your kids, right? And I've done this for my kids too, to be fair. When you rear the monarchs in captivity to the adult stage, people think if the monarch doesn't make it, if it dies in captivity, then you failed, right? It's only a success if that caterpillar turns into an adult butterfly and it flies away. But according to Mother Nature, 95% of them are supposed to die, right? And so when we do this in captivity, we're kind of teaching kids the wrong thing, that it's only a success if the caterpillar flies away. From an ecological perspective, it's actually more of a success if the caterpillar dies, if it gets eaten by something. From a biological perspective, the monarch caterpillar is designed to be eaten in nature. And so that's almost like their main job in the ecosystem. And so you can see how rearing in captivity doesn't really teach people about that main job. It teaches people what the life cycle is, yes. But then people sort of people get the impression then that it's a failure if the caterpillar doesn't survive. But I think it should be the opposite, right? I think we should be teaching, it doesn't teach people, I guess my philosophical problem is that it doesn't teach people what the real role of the caterpillar is in Mother Nature. And so I think this is where it's another situation where, people don't want to hear this, but, this is what people need to hear, because if people knew that, then they wouldn't be going out of their way to bring those caterpillars inside, right? If people saw the caterpillar being eaten and they were okay with it, that would sort of make it easier to just sort of, throw up your hands and say, okay, that's just Mother Nature. That's a hard thing for people to do, especially some of the newbies who want to get in there with their hands. They want to, physically help the monarchs. This is a lot to take in. Like everything you thought you knew about monarchs is wrong.
A lot of crushed dreams on this podcast today.
So let's pop some more bubbles and open another can of worms here. So rearing, probably we shouldn't be doing that. A lot of people that rear monarchs, a lot of times we'll purchase tropical milkweed because it stays green longer. They have food available longer for them into the fall when our native species are declining and not providing food for them. So what are some of the issues with growing this tropical milkweed?
Yeah, for the people who are just listening, I'm shaking my head at this one because you got another can of worms it's a really controversial issue. It shouldn't be, but it is. So to begin with, right, here's where I blame the Save the Monarchs campaign. People think that monarchs need milkweed or else the population is gonna go extinct, right? And so people go to their nearest big box store, they buy some milkweed, not really thinking about it. They bring it home and they plant it. In a lot of places, especially in the South, what they buy at the store is non-native milkweed. Milkweed is not native to this country, not even native to this continent in some cases. So a lot of these stores are selling this non-native milkweed because this is interesting. They're selling it because people want to buy it, right? And it's a big seller. So on the one hand, you can't really blame the nurseries for selling this stuff because you make a lot of money. But on the other hand, right, it's non-native. And so there's been a lot of research on the effects of tropical milkweed, for one, this one milkweed that's being sold a lot. And just like the captive rearing situation, all of the research that we've seen so far on the tropical milkweed shows that it's really bad for the monarch migration. There's a lot of problems with it. When monarchs grow up eating that milkweed, when the caterpillars eat that milkweed, it makes them, it changes their physiology, and so that it makes it sort of not so that they aren't really good at migrating. Their wings are slightly, is it smaller or is it they're lighter in color? I can't remember what the actual scenario, but there's problems with their wings. There's problems with their endurance, and so this milkweed, really all non-native milkweeds, have these similar problems where the monarchs haven't really adapted to those milkweeds in this country, so they haven't co-evolved with those milkweeds here in this country. In this country, in North America, all native milkweeds die back, as you said, at the end of the summer, as they're supposed to, right? But yet these non-native milkweeds tend not to. So where you are in Illinois, those non-native milkweeds, they'll probably die back at some point, right? When the snow starts falling, right? But by that time, they've been sort of in leaf long after the native milkweeds have all died back. Being in leaf, we think, kind of tricks the monarchs as they're migrating. So when a migrating monarch is flying over those milkweeds and sees a lush green milkweed, it tricks them into becoming a breeding monarch. It tricks them into thinking it's time for me to start laying eggs. And so we don't know how long it happened, how long it lasts. But when they see this milkweed, especially in further south of you, we think it alters their sort of migration instincts. There's some other issues with that non-native milkweed too, and this relates to something that we haven't gotten into yet on the podcast. There is a disease, a parasite that monarchs get that is being amplified in the population because of these non-native milkweeds. This disease, it's a protozoan parasite that lives on the monarchs. And as the monarchs are sort of flying around, they drop the infectious spores of this parasite onto the milkweeds. As the caterpillars hatch and eat the milkweed leaves, they then ingest some of those spores, and then they become infected. This parasite, it's a naturally occurring parasite that the monarchs have probably had for eons. However, it's always been at a low prevalence in this country, less than 0.5% of the population had this parasite. Now, it's more like 15% in the summer. It's a huge jump, and this jump has occurred exactly at the same time when the Save the Monarchs campaign started. And this jump has also coincided with the prevalence and the rise of these non-native milkweeds that people are planting. And captive rearing also spreads this parasite more. So a lot of these actions that people are doing, right, are sort of helping to exacerbate this parasite. And we know also that this parasite negatively influences the migration success of the monarchs. So you've got the non-native milkweeds that don't do any favors to the migration. You've got the parasite that also hinders the migration. And you've got captive rearing that also creates monarchs that aren't very good at migrating. And so it's almost no wonder that the thing that's in trouble right now is the fall migration to Mexico. And and the sad thing is, the sad irony is a lot of those three things are all being driven by the actions of well-meaning people trying to help. Isn't this crazy?
Yeah.
I mean, I bang my head against my desk every day in my Facebook group, right? Because more and more people come into the group joining, right, thinking that they're helping because they've been doing everything I just said. And it's like I have to sort of reprogram this person, yet another person who's been indoctrinated by this Save the Monarchs dogma. So for all of those reasons, right? This is why I'm kind of thinking, it might almost be a good thing if the Fish and Wildlife Service did list the monarchs as endangered, because then it would kind of be like hands off the monarchs, right? It would in one, fell swoop, we could kind of fix a lot of these issues. Maybe not the tropical milkweed thing, but it would certainly help. So yeah, my take home, motto for everybody these days is just leave the monarchs alone. That would solve a lot of problems.
So I will just keep restating this. Like when I'm talking to someone, so with Extension, we're deal with a lot with the public, and if I could direct that energy into something, what could I say to them? Like, what? I know you've been doing a lot of work. It's been very well-meaning. Is there any support habitat conservation? Like, is there anything I can point them to? Like, hey,
yep,
use that energy and do this.
Yeah, no, I get this a lot too. I do have a canned message that I tell people too. Really, I tell people that they can help. They don't necessarily need to help the monarchs, but you can sort of make your yard more insect friendly, and that would help a lot of things, right? Not in the way people think, right? Making a yard insect friendly, it won't just help the insects, but it would help the birds, right? Because like an insect friendly yard is like Mama Bird's grocery store, right? And people need to know that too, right? Insects, like monarchs, are a natural food source. They're low in the food chain for a reason, right? They are the base of the food chain for a lot of other animals. And so by making your own yard more insect friendly, you're helping all those other critters too. You're not just helping the insects, but you're helping all those other critters. So I tell people like some of the other things that other folks have said too, like reduce your lawn, right? Make your parts of your yard more, wild, rewild your yard in some places. And so there's ways you can actually work to help all critters low in the food chain. So I know you guys had another question for me, but the Joro spiders. Did you want to talk about that?
Yes, that is next on the list. So I guess for people who aren't familiar with them, I guess what are Joro spiders, and then how? I guess you've done some research on Joro spiders and monarchs. And I guess what's that interaction like? Yeah,
so this is another one of my newest dalliances in my research world. Another one of these things where I can't focus, and so. The Joro spiders are a new spider that's not native to this country that arrived in Georgia, where I am. And they arrived here 10 years ago. They've been spreading ever since. They're from East Asia. They're as big as your palm. So one of them would fill the size of my palm. They're huge. And their webs are like 6 feet wide. They're absolutely enormous. And they're coming your way. They're coming to Illinois. Probably in about 5 years, they'll be at your door. So they're spreading outward. But I kind of fell into studying these critters here, really because they just fell into my yard. Right, I've got hundreds of these in my backyard every fall now, and so I kind of just became captivated by them. I've been studying them ever since for the last 3 or 4 years, and it turns out that. It's weird to say this, but they are a media sensation, almost more so than the monarchs, but for a different reason. Like every time I do a new Joro spider study, it makes headlines like around the world. And it's because people are so freaked out about this, the fact about the possibility of this spider, this huge spider coming for them. And so the fear of these spiders is what's driving their media fandom, whereas it's the love of the monarchs that's driving theirs. And so I've got like two ends of a spectrum here. I studied two different critters that are loved and hated, but both get so much media attention. Anyway, so the latest study I did on the spiders was done. It came out earlier this year. It was done with some students of mine, and I actually combined these two different things: monarchs and Joro spiders. So the idea here was to see if the Joro spiders, which aren't native to this country, actually will eat the monarch butterflies, which are, as we all know, are toxic because monarchs grow up eating milkweed. Here's the interesting thing. The Joro spiders have never seen a monarch before, right? And so we wondered if they would know if the monarchs were toxic, which is a really interesting question. Anyway, so we conducted this very simple study where we literally just tossed some monarchs into Joro spider webs. It sounds weird, but we found that the Joro spiders actually did avoid eating the monarchs. And most of the monarchs, well, half the monarchs just flew away after the Joro spiders just ignored them. And so, I mean, it was kind of a good news story. But the interesting thing is that we found that the Joro spiders didn't actually need to touch the monarchs to learn to avoid them. Like, it wasn't that they tasted them or even touched them at all. They just looked at them and backed away. Whereas the other butterfly species we tossed in there for comparison, they attacked immediately. And so somehow the Joro spiders just knew to avoid eating the monarchs, even though they've never seen them before and they never even tasted them. And so that got us thinking that maybe the Joro spiders have some kind of like a extra sensory perception kind of thing where they can actually see some kind of a chemical scent or something like that, or they can sense it from a distance, which would be weird, right? Wow. And so we've got all sorts of ideas now for the next project, but it ended up being a neat study that, you know, I talked about it recently in my blog too, and in the Facebook group too. Surprisingly, it didn't get as much media attention as some of the other stories.
So I guess once they're going to be here in 5 years, are they like the Joro spiders? Are they? I guess that's something we should be concerned about. Are they going to like cause ecological havoc when they get here?
Yeah. So that's the question I've gotten from 1,000 different journalists. The answer is we don't know yet. Down here in Georgia, it doesn't look like these spiders are as bad as some of your other non-native, critters. Like in the Northeast, you've got the spotted lanternfly. I mean, that thing is a beast. It is literally eating trees, right? And people have orders to kill on sight, right? Because that thing is just horrible. The Joro spider isn't in that category. Like, I'm not telling people to go out and kill Joro spiders. It doesn't look like there's any damage, physical, obvious damage being done by these spiders. Yes, they're probably taking away insects from some of our native spiders. But on the other hand, I've actually documented where there's some positive effects of some of these Joro spiders too on some of our native fauna, like birds. Like, I've actually documented where there's some bird species that are actually coming in and eating some of the food bits left over from the Joro spider webs. So it might be a bit of a toss-up where there's some good, some bad, but we don't know yet. So there's no kill on site orders, even though people want to. It's another weird thing where people tell me these spiders must die. They're non-native, right? And I kind of feel like philosophically, it's not really the spider's fault that it's here. It's not really hurting you. It's just doing its thing. It's living its life. It's actually one of the shyest spiders in the world. I've actually tested that right here in this lab. There's a way to test shyness in spiders, and I tested it. And compared to other species, it's the shyest species of spider ever documented. And so they're really, really docile. So I tell people to get to know them, right? Instead of trying to squash them, you're not going to stop the spread. There's millions upon millions of them now. killing some in your yard, it may make you feel better, but it's not going to stop them. I could do a whole podcast on the Joro spiders. So maybe call me in 5 years.
We will have you back in 5 years. Don't retire. We need you. My goodness. Dr. Andy Davis, that was a lot of great information. Monarch misconceptions, setting the record straight. Thank you so much for being on the Good Growing Podcast today. We really appreciate your time. We will link to the Thoughtful Monarch Facebook page, to your blog, where that's where I found out about Joro spiders and monarchs.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. Yeah, it's always great to have a voice in a medium like this, right? And I appreciate what you guys do to help with this.
Well, the Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by me, Chris Enroth. Hey, thank you to Ken Johnson. Ken, thanks for hanging out with me, and probably was maybe a year or 2 years ago, pointing out, hey, there's this guy down in Georgia, Dr. Andy Davis. He knows something about monarchs. You should read his stuff. Thanks, Ken. That was a good show.
Yes, thank you, and thanks to Dr. Davis. Yes, it was good. Now we can point people to this podcast when they start asking us about stuff.
Exactly.
And all of that. Yeah. And let's do this again next week for possibly our greatest podcast ever.
Oh, we've reached the mountaintop, I think, here. We will do this again next week. Ken, I will see you next week for Cicada Extravaganza. We are going to be sampling these. The point of cicada emergence, as they do the periodical cicadas, is there's no way anything can eat as many of them as are out there. So it is defense by numbers. We're going to put that to the test. We're going to chow down on some cicadas next week with our nutritionist and our entomologist. So Kristen Bogdanis, Casey Athey, we will be with them in Springfield cooking cicadas. Look forward to that. I might see you next week. I don't know. Hopefully I'm not allergic to shellfish. We'll find out. So listeners,
bring an EpiPen just in case.
Thank you. Well, listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing. Hachi machi. This is big stuff here. We're hitting the big time, baby.